In this video, we're going to cover a Docker-based Django starter kit. So I pushed this code up to GitHub, and so we're going to go through kind of the installation and how to actually use this Docker starter kit. So first thing is we're going to download a copy of this, and I've already done that. I've got a copy on my desktop, so I'm just going to slide this over to the right here a little bit. That's the only step that I've done so far, is I've taken the GitHub repo and put it in a Docker directory on my desktop in another folder called docker_starter. All right, so we're going to pull in PyCharm, and I'm going to follow the README file. So there's a README part of the GitHub repo, and we're just going to kind of go through this step by step. So the first thing is I got to copy the .env example to .env, and so you can see in my directory structure under my Docker directory there is a .env example, and I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to rename that to .env. Now, one of the nice things about this Docker starter kit is if you want to change what versions you're using or change what ports are exposed, it's pretty easy to do. So that's what this .env file gives you. It gives you kind of control over the whole app. I'm just going to leave it the way it is right now with all the defaults. So my project is called Django. When I'm all done, I'm going to have a URL called django.local, and you can see everything here. I'm pretty much going to use the example.env, just the way it is. But if you wanted to tune this up and change, like for example, user or password for the database, feel free to do that. Another common area that you might want to change is if you have ports that are already used on your computer, you might want to expose different ports here. So I got these ports open, so I'm just going to leave everything the way it is. All right, so if I go back to the README file, we've done this copy. We've set up all of our settings the way I want them. So our next step is to update this host file so that our kind of local domain will resolve here in the browser. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my Mac. And so here is my host file. I'm just going to add another entry just like it says. All right, so after that step, we're all set up and we can start to kind of run our containers. If you haven't used Docker before, you're going to have to install Docker. So the install is pretty easy. You can go to the docker.com website here. You can find out where they have their installers. So down here at the bottom here, you can download Docker and install it. I'm not going to do that again. I'm on a Mac, so I just use the Docker desktop for Mac. If you're on Windows, you'd have to do it for Windows. But I'm not going to cover those bits right now. So I'm assuming that you've got Docker installed already. So this next step, number 2, is optional. If you have an existing Django project and you want to use this Docker container, what you're going to have to do is put that code into the directory that you've specified here for your path to your code. So in my case, it's /code. So if I had existing code, I would create a new directory here called code, and I would drop my Django code in there. I don't have it, so I'm just going to delete this. I don't really need it right now. When I start this thing up, it will take care of everything for me. So step 3 is to actually start the containers. So a lot of command line, but if you just want to copy and paste this, you can copy and paste it here. But I'm running this from inside my Django starter. I'm inside the Docker directory. So I got access to all this Docker compose, and all these files are in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this command here, docker compose up-d build nginx. And later on, once we get this thing running, I'll spend a little bit of time just kind of going through the Docker files for you if you're interested in that, but that'll be towards the end of the video here. So it's going to go through and build all the layers for the containers. That might take longer on your machine. I've already kind of done this a couple of times on my machine, so all of the base images are already present. And it says everything's running. If I go to my Docker desktop, I can actually see kind of the running containers. And we'll cover the basis here in a little bit, but at a high level, we have an Nginx container that has Nginx running. Nginx is going to kind of serve as a proxy in front of our Python code. And so the Python code is in this Django Python container, And if you look, you see everything's prefixed with Django here. That's because of this setting in the .env file. So if you want to change that prefix, if you have multiple Django apps and you want multiple different containers, just change that app name or that project name so that each container gets prefixed with some unique identifier. And you can see Postgres here. Postgres already has, it's using a base image that already has PostGIS installed. So you're all set for your GIS kind of applications. And then Redis here. Redis is being used currently for kind of session caching. So the other thing you'll notice is now we have a code directory. And this code directory is your standard Django project. In fact, if you look under the Docker Django entry point here, you can kind of see that there's a command that you're familiar with. If you kind of set Django up manually, you have to kind of at some point run this command to start your project. So we've created a project called My Site, and that's why this is called My Site here, and it's in the current directory, which is code here. So that now is our new project. Again, if you would have had an existing project you dropped in here, it would not have ran this for you, and you would have just been using your kind of existing code base. All right, so the next step is we just completed step number 3. So next thing we're going to do is update our host file. This is inside our settings, our Django settings file. If you were to kind of navigate to the site right now, and I've got it up here. So if you navigate to https://django.local, and again, Django.local is because of my .env selection. I called this Django.local. And then it's on port 44301, which is, again, that's part of my configuration here. And if I navigate to that URL, I get this error. So most of the setup is just kind of, trying to stay ahead of you run into these errors, but you're going to get to this error first. So to fix this, we have to work on step number 4. So step number 4 is I take this, kind of these values, and we're going to put it in our settings.python file. And so here's my allowed hosts. I can drop these in. And again, if you have different domains or hosts, then you're going to have to update the name here and the port number. So if I save this file and then I come back to my browser and I update, this error should go away and I should see my standard Django entry page. So the next step is we're going to configure Django so that it's actually using the containerized Postgres. Right now you can see if I go to the admin page and I hit refresh here, this page will load. There's actually a database in the back end, but it's using SQLite. So under the code, you can see the SQLite file right here, and that's where your data is actually being stored at this point. So what we're going to do is just reconfigure this a little bit. Not that hard. So first of all, I have to create a .env file inside my code directory. So we're going to create a new file here called .env, and I'm just going to take what it says right here. Again, because I'm using the actual example, and because I'm using the example as it is, I don't have to have any changes here. That was the name of the DB, and that was the user and the password. If you change those things, then you'll have to update them here. So I create that new file, and then I have to go and I have to add a couple of things in my settings. So at the very top on the imports, we're going to add a few new imports to our settings file. And then we have to read that environment file that we just created. So I'll put this right after the base directory because it kind of uses the base directory. You can see that here in the code. Uses that variable, so put that after it's set. And then we're going to replace the existing database configuration with what it says here. So I'll just replace all of that. And you can see what we're doing is we're actually using the environment variables that are set in our local.env file, which is there. All right, so I've saved this. Let's go back to our README file. And the next thing that I have to do is I have to run those migrations on my new database. And so to run migrations here, normally you would type something like python manage.py migrate. But because we're inside of the container, I actually want this command to run inside the container. So normally you would run that, but now you would have to run something like docker compose exec, and you're going to run on the Django container, and then you're going to put your command in there. Now, that's a lot to type. Every time I want to run that kind of a Python manage command, I don't want to have to type all that. So I'm going to get out of here. There is a PyManage shell command, which takes most of that away for you. So I don't have to type so much. It's really kind of running the same thing. All I need to do is provide the command. So that's what we're going to use. We're going to use PyManage, and then we're going to say migrate, and it'll run the migrations on our new database, which is inside the container. So next step is to create that super user. Again, we're going to use our PyMan, our shell script there to help us out a little bit. And we're going to create super user. And then just follow the instructions as you normally do. I'm going to call mine admin. No email address. My password is secret. And secret's a little too small. Doesn't like it, but we'll move forward anyways. So now I should be able to log in admin secret. And I should be able to log in. At this point, we're actually using the database that's inside the container, the Postgres container. So at this point, I should be able to delete this SQLite container. I don't need this anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and get it out of the project. So we're still running here. We're running under the Postgres in the container. So the next step is we're going to switch to using Redis for our caching and our session cache. So to make that change, we have to make changes to the settings.python file again. Here's the settings changes that we need. I'm just going to copy those. I'm going to bring those over here. I'm just right under the database. I'm just going to drop that new configurations in, and I'm going to hit save. So now Redis will be used as our cache. And notice I'm logged in over here, but you would expect that my old session, which was kind of in the memory of the Python container, isn't valid anymore. So when I refresh, I'm expecting that I'm probably going to have to log in again. And so we're back here. This admin secret, again, that should still work because that's in our database that's in Postgres, but now my session is now in the Redis database. All right, so if we come back to the README file, we just pretty much completed step 6 here. And now these URLs should work, and we've already got both these URLs up. So this is the normal kind of landing page, and then this is the admin page. All right, the next thing I want to cover is take a look at some of these exposed services. We've already kind of seen Nginx, and it's exposed on HTTPS and HTTP, and we can see those over here. But let's talk about Postgres and Redis. I've got So I use DataGrip from JetBrains, and I'm just going to center this up here so we can see a little bit more. And you can see both of these things are connected. I'm going to look at the Postgres first. So Postgres, I look at the properties, and that's just the name. It's on localhost. Here's the port 54321. And if we go back to our .env file, that's this port number right here. So Postgres is exposed on 54321. It's inside my Docker container. So if I do this connection, and again, using Django, which is this user right here, and the password was secret. So those are the credentials. I set that up here in DataGrip, and then I can navigate to and see my Postgres database. So I'll load up all the schemas here. And in the public one, that's where we can see our users table, and our auth users table has one user, which is our admin user that we created earlier. The other thing that we can see here is our cache. So Django Redis, again, connection-wise, kind of the same thing, localhost 6379. And if I look at here, 6379 is the Redis port that's exposed. We currently don't have Redis configured to use a username or password. So if I go back to my connection, there's no username or password here. But when I look at it, I do see the sessions. And so we can see a value for sessions here, and it's kind of in its standard format there. And then at the very bottom, I'm just kind of revisiting the two kind of helpers that you have. So you have this helper, PyMan, which again is essentially like you typing out Python manage. So this is Python manage, but it's a little helper, so you don't have to type that in every time, because remember, you have to type in docker compose exec Django in front of it, and that gets to be a little verbose. So pyman, which is a helper. So if I run this right now, it's just like running the manage command by itself, and you get the list of commands that you can run. And so with that pyman shell command, you can make migrations, you can collect your statics. All of that is available for you to do inside the Docker container using that shortcut. All right, and the second helper is this pip command. So instead of typing, so again, normally I might want to run pip install or pip commands inside my Python container. So in order to do that, again, I would normally have to type docker compose exec, put the name of the container, which is Django in this case, and then the command you want to run. But instead of typing all of that, again, if you look at this helper, it's an executable. It kind of runs that first part for you and takes whatever you put after it and puts that on the command. So instead of running all that every time, I can say pip, and then maybe I want to get a list of all of the packages that are installed. So we can run pip list, and again, this runs inside the Docker container. So inside the Docker container, that's what's currently installed. All right, and then I'll talk about the final two options down here. So at sometimes you may have to get a shell inside one of the containers so you can run some additional commands. And in those cases, you have these two options at the bottom. So if the container's not running, you can use docker compose run, and you can do it this way, where you have -it for an interactive shell. You put the entry point is going to be /bin/sh, and then you put the service. So our service maybe is Django. But we can see right here, I've got these containers are running. So let's go ahead and actually we'll do this bottom one here. So if you look at it again, it's I'm going to type in docker compose and then exec -it for an interactive kind of shell. The service we're going to get into is Django, and I'm just going to get bin/sh. And so when I run this, you can see the terminal prompt has changed to the hashtag. If I print my working directory, I'm now inside the container. There's not much in there. I mean, it's a very slimmed down container, but you can see kind of where the code is. I can ls-la, so I can see all the code. I can see the .env file. And now, if I need to, I can run some additional commands. You know, most of the time you don't have to do this, but this is handy if you have to kind of run some shell commands inside the containers. And I can exit out, and I'm back at my Docker prompt here. So I'm going to close all these tabs out. The last thing is how to shut this thing down. So if I type docker compose down, it will take all of the containers that are running, and it'll start to shut them down in the order that it needs to kind of stop them. And so you can see it's kind of shutting these things down. Some of them take a little while to kind of shut down, not that long, but they eventually will all clean up and shut down. The images are still kind of around, so I still have the Postgres image, so you don't have to re-download that every time. There's still other images in here for Django, Nginx, Django. So those images are still there. If I want to start this thing back up, it's really easy for me to start them back up. So once I've stopped my containers, obviously I can't reach my app anymore, but if I want to start them up again, the command is here. I can either copy and paste it. So that's one way to get it going. So I typically have a couple of aliases that I've kind of defined. So if I look at, for example, DC, I don't have to type docker compose all the time. So I type DC, and I also have an alias called DCR. So docker compose run --rm, because sometimes that's very common. So I'll typically type in DC up -d build Nginx, and then that'll get everything started for me. And then once it starts back up again, obviously all the sessions were shut down when we lost Redis, so I'll have to log back into any sessions that I had going again. But I'm back into the app. All right, so real quick, I want to cover what's all in the Docker directory. And so you downloaded most of this from the GitHub repo, but let's just cover, for example, the two things that weren't downloaded. First of all, we didn't download this .env file. And again, we created that initially when we started this project by copying .env_example, and then you can tweak whatever you need to tweak. And then this Postgres directory isn't here. If you look at the compose file for Postgres, the Postgres service, so it's mapping this local directory here, which corresponds to this directory, to the /var/lib/postgresql directory, which is where Postgres stores its data internally. So in the container, it thinks it's storing it locally, but it's really in a kind of a mapped volume. So when you shut down Postgres and you start it back up, all your data isn't deleted because it was in the container and you had to, when you rebuilt the image, it got deleted. All your data is in here. So this is where all the data is for Postgres. It's a very easy way to kind of persist that data across sessions when you're kind of Docker down, Docker up, Docker rebuild, or whatever you're doing. Your data isn't getting deleted. You don't have to kind of worry about your data. So if you're familiar with Docker, this Docker compose YAML file allows you to kind of compose services together. So it's aptly named here, but you can see Nginx. This is the Nginx service. How to build it, we're using kind of Nginx Docker file. There's some arguments that I'm passing into it, which are the Nginx version and the app domain, which kind of come from our .env file. So if you see Nginx version and the app domain, so we're passing those variables into our build directory. So this is the Nginx Docker file. So we'll look at that in a second. This container is named whatever this project name is _Nginx. So that comes from here. So Django _Nginx. So when you look at your container name, that's the container name. That's where it's coming from. This depends on Django. Remember, Nginx is kind of a proxy in front of Django, so it kind of depends on Django. It wants to be up and running. So technically, you probably don't need to have this volume mapped in there right now. So right now, I'm taking the code directory and I'm mapping it inside the Nginx container. And right now, Nginx really isn't serving anything, but I kind of want it to be able to serve up the static files. So when we kind of gather our static content, I want to be able to have Nginx serve that directly. And so that's what I'm already kind of working on a little bit here. So I just got this mapped in here and kind of to help me support that. The 2 ports that are exposed, again, this is on the hosts. So if we look at HTTP on the host over here, we've seen this a couple times already, but HTTP on the host for Nginx is 44301. So that's what 44301 is mapped to 443 inside the container. And then we put all these services on kind of a central network so they can all talk together. So Nginx can talk to Postgres through this app network because they're all on the same network. Same thing with Django. It's all on that same network, and Redis is on the network also. So that's kind of going through Nginx. If you look at Postgres, it's kind of the same thing, but we're not building it using a Docker file. We're actually using an image from Docker Hub, and this image already has the PostGIS packages already installed, and all of the extensions to Postgres are already kind of there for Postgres. So that's why I'm using this image. I don't want to rebuild that every single time. Again, we're mapping the volume. So this is our local disk right here, and it's stored where Postgres will normally put its data. So every time it writes data, if you do a SQL update command or any changes to the database schema or any fields or rows or anything, it'll automatically store in our local copy here. We're passing into this environment, kind of the username, password, database, of course, and all of those things. What ports are being exposed? Again, we can look at this one, .env, Postgres, 54321. That's what's being exposed on the host. If it fails, it automatically restarts. And there's a health check here. Honestly, could probably remove this at this point. At one point, I was trying to use this health check so that I could test and see when Postgres was ready, but I figured out a different way to do that. So I probably don't need that anymore, but it's on the same network. If we look at Django, Django here is doing the same kind of thing. We're building it from a local Docker file. We're passing in some args. Probably don't need that space. We named the container, mapping certain volumes and mapping the code into this container. We will need this code inside the Python container. Setting the working directory to app/code. That's exactly where we mapped the code. So this path to code, which corresponds to this directory, gets mapped into the container into this directory here called /app/code. And then we're setting our working directory to that. Django exposes 8080 on the app network. It doesn't expose it to outside, so I can't get to port 8080. So if I try to go to port 8080 over here, and I want to look for maybe the home page, this port isn't exposed, so that should come back and it can't find that, so it can't be reached. So this port is exposed internally, so that if when we look at Nginx eventually, it proxies requests from port 80 or 443 to the Django kind of proxy on port 8080. It depends on a couple other services. Redis and Postgres has this entry point, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but essentially we're going to run this entry point.sh file, which is in this Django directory. We'll look at that in a second. Attached to the same network as everything else, and it's saying I'm using this .env file, which is that one right there. And then the last service is Redis. Redis, again, restart unless it stopped. I'm using a image from Docker Hub, a certain version, which is specified in at the top of our .env file. The container name exposes certain ports. It does expose that port, so I can log in and look at it if I want. Probably you don't need to necessarily expose this Redis port, and that would make it a little more secure because, again, we don't have a username or password on this. But if I just expose the port like I did here, then it's not really exposed to kind of the host of the container, just exposed on this network. So because Nginx actually depends on Django, what I'm going to do is let's look at Django here. And this depends on Postgres and Redis, which are just kind of images by themselves, and we're not really modifying them. But here's the Docker file that builds Django. And so you can look at this Python Docker file. And if you're familiar with how Docker works, Docker starts with like a base image, and then every single command like modifies that base image and adds what they call as a layer. And so every command is a layer, and then after all the layers have been changed, you'll end up with your image that you're using to kind of run your application or your container. And so we can look at the changes to the Python base layer. So Python version, again, is coming from this argument that we're passing in, which is coming from the .env file. So that's Python version right here, 3.9. So if you want to change the Python version, you change it in your .env file and you Docker up, and it'll rebuild it for you. Then we start to get into the changes to the different layers. So here we're running an update. So this base image that we pulled down from GitHub maybe is a little bit old and it doesn't have the update. So our first layer is we're doing an update, and we've done all of those changes. So then we're adding support for the geospatial data abstraction library, which we'll be using for kind of the PostGIS integration. And then here we're updating pip. Here on line number 14, we finally install in all of our kind of packages for Python here. You may need to install others depending on what your project will need eventually. And then we set the working directory to our /app, which is kind of where our code is. And then the last thing we do is we add a file to this kind of image. So this base image, we build it up and we put this file in this /app/entry_point.sh file. And we're going to go look at that in a second, but that's the file. If you look back at our Docker Compose, that's what's run as our entry point. So using bash, we call that entry_point.sh file, which is put in the Docker image by this kind of line 18. So after the image is built, this volume is attached. So I know that this /app/code directory is going to exist. And then after it's done all these exposing of ports and everything here, then it runs this entry point. And so if we look at this entry point now, the first thing we do is we switch into the directory. We know that that's going to exist. So this little bit of code from line 4 to 7, it looks for an existing manage.py file. And if it finds one, then it's not going to run what's inside there. But if that doesn't exist, then it's going to run your Django admin command for you and start your project up. And that's why, we see this my site. This automatically appeared when we kind of Docker composed up. It's not magic. It just kind of detected that you didn't have a project and it created one for you. So that's there. The other thing that it does is every time you restart your image, it runs through this code. And so your requirements file, I would recommend that you keep that up to date. So all the requirements are here, and it'll pip install all your requirements that you need for your project. So I would regularly, run the pip freeze and export it out to the requirements file so that you can keep that file up to date. But that's how every time you restart your Docker containers, that's how they stay up to date. Lines 13 through 17, it's a little while loop, and we're just waiting for us to be able to connect to Postgres. Again, on the app network, Postgres is on 5432. So, and that's again on this network here, this app network. Internally to kind of all the Docker containers, they're talking to each other just on those normal ports. So 5432, I'm waiting for a connection here, and you'll see it sleeps 1 second, but I just wait until I see the connection. Once I see the connection, I run my migrations. So if there's migrations to be run, it runs them automatically. Again, I'm kind of working on this already. It doesn't quite work yet, but eventually I'll be able to collect the static files into one spot, and we'll serve those up into Nginx. Here's where I'm running my server. And you notice here, I actually am running just a normal dev server, which is fine because we're in a dev environment. If you wanted to run gUnicorn instead, you could comment this one out and put gUnicorn in here, and this should run just fine. One of the things I found was this part at the end, I haven't been able to get it to just kind of update code automatically. So when I make a change to here to maybe a template or a layout, I'm not seeing that reflected right away. And so I wasn't able to figure that out yet. So that's why I'm running kind of in this state. I'm hoping that at some point I will have gUnicorn running by default. All right, so we've covered the Python. So if we go back to the compose file, we've covered all of this service. The Redis service there's nothing really to cover here. The Postgres service is not really anything to cover in that one, but let's look at the Nginx service. So Nginx has a Docker file, we're building it. So again, we'll go look at the Nginx Docker file, and it's the same concept. Starts with the base image of Nginx, and it adds layers. So it installs OpenSSL. So at some point, we want to be able to serve up HTTPS. It does create self-signed certificates, and so we'll see that in a second. One of the first things it does is it replaces the default config file with kind of our website config. So let's look at this website config file. So you're going to find that here under Nginx website config. So I open this up, you're going to see at the very top, there's an upstream server definition, and it has a name called Django_project. And then it says server, and there's a server located at this host, and this is the port. So where does it get this host from? How does it resolve that? Well, Docker takes care of that for you. So when we set up this Docker compose file, we named this service called Django, and so that is the host, and because it's on the app network, it'll resolve this for you. So when you see Django here, that's the host. Why is that port happening? If you recall, under our entry point code, when we started our Django server, we're running on port 8080, and so that's why that port's called. This server on this host and this port is called Django_project. And if we scroll down here a little bit, when we start to look at where Nginx proxies calls in from the web over to Python, you can see it's proxying those calls to Django_project. And that's how everything gets forwarded from, as a web request over to kind of our WSGI proxy and proxied over into the Python call. So that's what this little bits are doing right here. So it's proxying, any incoming calls over to that. And at the very bottom, you can see these certificates, and these certs are created. If you go back to our Docker file, they're created manually. Down here at the very bottom, these last little bits are all about creating those certs. I'm not going to go into that code, but you can look at that code yourself. So if you go under certs, there's a couple more shells, which creates the certificate authority, all of this. And then there's another shell script that creates the actual certificate based on that certificate authority. And so I'm not going to cover the details of what those two scripts do, but they are run here to create these certificates. There's a key and a cert, and that's how the SSL is served up. It's a self-signed certificate, so you're always going to get this little insecure indicator from Chrome or Firefox. You'll have to click through there and allow access. All right, so that covers everything. So we covered how to get started. Again, if you're interested in just getting started and you don't want to understand the guts of all of the Docker file and Docker Compose, just follow the README file. It's pretty simple. Step by step will get you going. And then at the end of the video, we just kind of covered the details of what's all really kind of going on, the Docker Compose and the Docker files. So if you need to make modifications, you can go ahead and make modifications. And if you're interested in kind of improvements, or you find any bugs or something's not working, then go ahead and use the GitHub issues requests, go and create an issue, and I will look at it from there.